I'll be honest with you, readers. After seeing how the character was utilized in the Suicide Squad, my anticipation for Peacemaker kinda lowered itself a bit. Yes, I love the rivalry between him and Bloodsport, and it made sense for there to be a final showdown between the two of them considering said rivalry. But acting as a stooge for Amanda Waller and then killing Rick Flag made me think that whatever James Gunn was planning for Peacemaker in his HBO Max show was going to try to make me feel like his actions were justified, or that I should show sympathy for him. And after a long history of being exposed to characters of Christopher Smith's combination of privilege and complexion with those purposes in mind, I was no longer in the mood to do either. What are you talking about, spoilers for the Suicide Squad? It's been out for almost a year. You have to have seen the pivotal parts of the movie in order to understand what's going on in Peacemaker. What are you talking about? Did you literally decide to watch all of Peacemaker without thinking that it would be wise to watch the movie that chronologically came before Peacemaker? Why are you like this? But then, as if anticipating all of my reasonings for not wanting to watch it, James Gunn went, hey, look, Laurent, trust me, I get it, okay? I get it. But what if I did these two things? 1. A black lesbian couple that's allowed to be fleshed out, developed characters that are their full, authentic selves without pandering to traditional queer stereotypes and don't utilize the bury your gays trope. And 2. Yes, complexity in Peacemaker's character, but it's rooted in both toxic and fragile masculinity and how both nationalist and supremacist ideals can be allowed to grow from trauma and the need of acceptance. The kicker here is that while these are definitely aspects that have piqued my interest on a personal and analytical level that I expected to be addressed as the season played out its 8-episode run, the seeds for both points 1 and 2 were planted in Peacemaker in the very first episode. And while seeing the queerness of Danielle Brooks' Leota Adebayo be both present and acknowledged as much as her straight Argus counterparts helped me initially get into the show, I can't help but admit that seeing how James Gunn decided to explore this aspect of Peacemaker's character, especially with how certain aspects of his beliefs were influenced thanks to the want of his father's approval and respect, was both very interesting and comes from a very real place. That's why for today's lesson, I want to explore how Peacemaker Season 1 uses Chris Smith's backstory and development to explore these themes and how they parallel real-life supremacist indoctrination via trauma and acceptance, both how it succeeds in getting its point across and how it avoided racist tropes that originated in white liberal guilt. Let's begin. Hey readers, Laurent here, offering you analysis and perspective on your favorite bits of geek and pop culture media. If it wasn't obvious from the intro, this video will in fact contain spoilers for Season 1 of DC's Peacemaker. It's currently available to stream on HBO Max, so give it a watch before continuing here if you haven't seen it yet and don't want me to spoil pivotal points of it for you in this video. Other than that, if you end up liking what I'm putting down after this video is done, there are multiple ways that you can show some love. If you want to help financially support the channel, you can join my Patreon. There are multiple tiers that range from $1 to $20 that give you access to things such as copies of my video scripts, early video releases, and discount codes to my merchandise store. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you'll get a heads up on whenever I post a new video. That's the syllabus. Now on to the lesson. So, why Peacemaker? Now, there's a long answer and a short answer for this question, both being pretty fair and understandable explanations as to why only this character, out of all the ones from the Suicide Squad, could get away with the narrative that this show aimed to deliver. But for the sake of my video watch time, I'll go with the long one. So the version of Peacemaker that we received in the Suicide Squad and the titular show is based on the first version of the character Christopher Smith. In the comics, he's a bit different than what we've seen portrayed by John Cena, but eventually gets to something closer to it after DC Comics' first big status quo changing comic event, Crisis on Infinite Earths. Pre-Crisis, the Christopher Smith Peacemaker was a pacifist that used non-violent weapons to fight dictators and warlords. Post-Crisis, Chris Smith Peacemaker discovered that he got his violent approach to peace from his dad, who was a commandant at a Nazi death camp. You can already see the resemblance of the version of Peacemaker we eventually got, can't you? And it kinda makes sense to choose Peacemaker considering this version of the character is what James Gunn chose as his blueprint. When you compare Peacemaker to all of the surviving members of Task Force S from the Corto Maltese mission, Bloodsport, Ratcatcher, Harley, everyone else had their development happen before or during the Suicide Squad and didn't really need that much exploring. King Shark and Weasel obviously being the exceptions here. So considering everyone that survived already pretty much had their moment in or before the Suicide Squad, James Gunn choosing to save Peacemaker and explore this problematic dynamic that is this take on the Golden Age version of the character makes the most sense out of all of them. However, thanks to Peacemaker being a secondary villain in the Suicide Squad, considering him killing off the poster boy for both the franchise and the comic series Rick Flag, along with what he was instructed by Amanda Waller to do regarding Operation Starfish, the problem is getting people to care enough about him to watch an 8-episode season dedicated to the exploration of this type of character. Thankfully, this is James Gunn we're talking about, who, thanks to Guardians of the Galaxy, and especially thanks to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, has succeeded in getting audiences interested enough in watching the development of lesser known, morally questionable, and overall douchebaggy characters. And according to James Gunn, Peacemaker is, in fact, one of the most douchebaggy characters in mainstream comics that he's ever experienced. But leaving the version of Peacemaker he chose for both the Suicide Squad and the Peacemaker show as is, couldn't really work according to the timeline both stories take place in inside the DCEU. So in order to explore the elements about Peacemaker's character that Gunn wanted to focus on, things had to be updated. More specifically, who in the DCEU his father is, in order to give this version of Chris Smith the same conflict of moral and ethic interests his Golden to Silver Age comic book counterpart had. And according to James Gunn, despite being just as bad and representative of what he was going for, one of the best ways to do that was switch out the Nazi death camp commandant for something more reflective of modern-day hatred and supremacy that's just as prominent of a figure in DC Comics. And that was making Chris Smith's dad in the DCEU the white supremacist supervillain, White Dragon, played by the Porsche of Terminators himself, Robert Patrick. And here's why it works. The multiple versions of White Dragon were never the identity of Peacemaker's father in the comics. But one thing about every iteration of White Dragon in DC Comics that's true is that he's a racist piece of shit. And due to it always being part of James Gunn's plan to replace Chris's Nazi overseer father from the comics with the supervillain in question, not only does it make sense to do so considering when Peacemaker takes place in the DCEU's timeline, but it adds the finishing touch his character needed in order to give us a legit reason why we should care about him. By giving Augie Smith the identity of White Dragon, along with the racism and xenophobia usually associated with the character that James Gunn thankfully made sure not to make subtle at all, it gives Christopher a connection to the struggle and inner frustration of his morality and ethics that the comics initially alluded to in a way that better impacts him and his familiar surroundings. Peacemaker is, after all, a jingoistic white dude in his mid-40s, possibly suffering from antisocial personality disorder, that's being tasked with stopping an alien invasion that's taking place in his hometown of Evergreen, Georgia. So growing up with the ideals and abuse centered around white supremacy and neo-Nazism, under the disguise of patriotism and nationalism, allows for a better connection to modern-day hate and white libertarianism than what Peacemaker would have been allowed to experience if they kept true to his comic book upbringing as the source of his trauma. But what made me appreciate James Gunn's change to making White Dragon Peacemaker's father all the more was because, thanks to the lack of subtlety throughout the show, it allowed the conflict to be better visualized by those who watch the show that grew naturally uncomfortable with how Peacemaker's upbringing and moral conflict with his father relates to their own. It was obvious that this was what they were building up to, even in episode 1, when we see Chris struggle with his dad's racism upon meeting up with him after leaving the hospital, yet still desire to connect with him in a way a son traditionally wants to with his father, despite receiving insult after insult and a clear indication that Augie sees him as weak and lesser. But what showed me how powerful this could be was episode 4, The Chode Less Traveled, when Adebayo lays down the damage Augie's done to both society and Peacemaker himself.
He's a white supremacist who used to dress up as a supervillain called the White Dragon.
He's not as bad as he seems.
He thinks people with my color skin are second-class citizens. Your dad is not a good man. Not to the world, and especially not to you.
And ever since then, the result of that reality check, even if it was given to unsuccessfully stop him from visiting his father, has stuck with Peacemaker, causing him to actually reflect on a lot of things in his past that he didn't want to admit or reveal about himself. And all I could think about when I saw that struggle initially stirred by Adebayo's words was, damn, if this character started feeling this way from that one interaction, I can only imagine how real people in the same boat would react to seeing this play out. The combination of making this amalgamation of White Dragon that's so blatant in his racism, xenophobia, supremacy, and nationalism to the point where it's incredibly hard to ignore, be the father of an individual who fails to see and focus on the damage that such an upbringing has done to him and his current mindset thanks to a need of his acceptance, respect, and love, is the perfect storm that a lot of people who would naturally be attracted to a character like this need to experience and see themselves in, because otherwise they wouldn't accept such a reality check any other way. Because representation is important, especially representation that forces you to reflect on harsh truths about yourself that you don't really want to dwell on, that you want to ignore, put to the side, pretend doesn't exist, and not think about how it's impacted you in toxic, negative ways. And in seeing Chris go through these notions, the demographic who watch Peacemaker that are affected by this are going to think that they're just watching the antics of a douchebag character that's gonna grow a conscience like James Gunn's other superhero-related works. But instead of experiencing that, they're going to see a mirror held up to their faces. Or, themselves reflected off of one of Peacemaker's many helmets. They're going to see the messed up beliefs and stereotypes that they had about their fellow men all this time, and thought that just because they never acted on them or said the assumptions out loud, that they're not like those who are constantly on the news acting on them. They're gonna be presented with the racism and bigotry that was regularly displayed in their still alive parents and grandparents during their time as young people in the 50s and 60s, some that still contribute to said thoughts and beliefs, but in a way that doesn't get them mainly criticized, yet continue to write it off and ignore their past actions and lack of change over the course of the decades that followed because they were just brought up at a different time. And if they're not careful, they're going to be presented with what may happen to them if certain things are done to immediately and violently address the source of the problematic behavior for instant gratification, without proper reflection, acceptance, or work to be at peace with and forgive yourself in order to step away from the trauma and mindset to become better. James Gunn said it himself in his interview with Polygon regarding the change. He says, and I quote, "It's incredibly important for who Christopher Smith is in that he knows his father is immoral and yet also seeks his father's approval because he is his father and he's imprinted on him like a duckling. The fact that he's in the shadow of this really terrible supervillain, who was also a supervillain who sees himself as a superhero, it just seemed to be what was most honest, and it reflects a part of our world and a part of our country that's affecting all of us. And how do you deal with that?" End quote. Like I stated before, this point in the development of Peacemaker, in order for people like him to understand what's going on with them, along with how hard it's driven over the course of the season, both the healthy and toxic ways it's displayed and how he copes with it, is a hard truth that's extremely necessary for some folks to hear. And considering the background of the other members of Task Force X that were in the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker was already the blueprint to adjust and fit to modern day that could bring this conflict to the screen. But while I'm glad that reality check was given to Chris in episode 4 that caused him to dwell and reflect on things over the course of the rest of the season, even if the end result jump-started a whole mess of new problems he has to hurdle through, there's also a part of me that felt the need to ask a question a lot of us were asking since watching the continuation of the story from that point forward. And that question is, out of all of the Argus members that could have had that conversation with Chris in episode 4, why Leota Adebayo? Leota Adebayo is an original character created by James Gunn for Peacemaker and the DCEU as a result. Not only is she Amanda Waller's daughter, not to be confused with her comic universe daughters, Demita, Coretta, Claudia, and Celine. God, she has a lot of kids. But she's also one of the best recent examples of black queer representation in mainstream media I've seen since Phastos in Eternals. Yes, I do know about Lightning and CW's Black Lightning, but I'm so behind on that show, like the first 4 to 5 episodes of season 1. I'll watch it though, I promise. The point I'm trying to make in this regard, however, because I definitely admit to have fallen victim to this in my first watch of the show as well, is that both her actions in episode 4 as well as her friendship established with Chris over the course of the season can easily be interpreted by individuals tired of the trope as giving her the makings of a magical Negro archetype. And before I get into my explanation, I want to assure some of you who are still on the fence that this, thankfully, is not the case. For those unaware of the trope, the magical Negro is a black stock character in fiction, whose main purpose in fiction is to come to the aid of the white protagonist or a group of white characters. Because of this, they have no agency as characters with wants, desires, or motives of their own, other than making sure the white lead or leads get the help or agency they need in order to develop and advance throughout the story, whether that aid be magical, spiritual, moral, or ethical. One of the biggest perpetrators of this trope is Stephen King, in which my fellow YouTuber Princess Weeks produced a very thorough analytical essay on very popular stories of King that have utilized and reinforced this trope in his fiction and the adaptation of his fiction, as well as how his use of the trope over the course of his career has perpetuated the use of it in modern fiction to this day. You can check it out in either the link on the screen or in the description down below. I think it's safe to say that because of these commonalities found in the magical Negro trope, for a lot of us geeks of color who watched Peacemaker, seeing a character in it like Adebayo, an African-American lesbian created by a white dude in a TV show centered around the development of a problematic white dude that isn't beyond redemption, was definitely worrying. Especially when you take into account all of the black characters we've seen and experienced in the past that literally only existed just to cater to the development of white leads. But while Adebayo had her moments that made us worry at first glance, what sets her apart is that not only is she allowed to be her own character that grows and develops and thrives, but she is not Chris's initial instrument used for his growth over the course of the season. If anything, the two have parallel development arcs that, by the time the season ends, have branched out in such different ways that Adebayo comes out of it in a way that's way healthier than that of who the show is actually about. Let's actually talk about said parallels right quick. Chris's father is the white supremacist supervillain White Dragon, who he constantly struggles with coming to terms with the abuse and trauma he was forced to endure just for the sake of getting his approval. Adebayo's mother is Amanda Waller, the leader of Argus and overseer of the Task Force X program. She is constantly aware of the things Waller is forcing her to do over the course of the show, thanks to the combination of her own judgment and that of her wife, but is struggling with making the morally just decision surrounding her own ethics because of things like the lie of capitalistic sustainability. She doesn't want to be an Argus agent, despite proving that she does, in fact, have a knack for this line of work, and doesn't want this one job she's on to give her mother the opportunity to persuade her to be one. She also doesn't have the capability of cutting off secondary emotions like guilt when Waller forces her to jeopardize the rapport that she and Chris have established by planting the journal in his trailer. But the money from this one job will be enough for her, her wife, and their 2 fur babies to put down proper roots in ways that will allow them to live their lives as they intended, that the lack of funds would have obviously kept them from doing without forms of debt. I say this because in revisiting the reality check Adebayo gave Chris in episode 4, she was clearly speaking from experience with her own parent when she said this to him about his own.
Well, we all want to believe that our parents are flawed but innately good, and maybe, usually, that's the case. But not here.
We know this because after she personally took pages out of the Wall's playbook when it came to emotional manipulation in order to get things in motion for the sake of the mission and felt terrible about it, she realized that despite being good at what she does, she is not her mother, nor does she want to be. And after the death of the butterfly's cow, made it her mission to use her skill set that Amelia Harcourt assured her that she had to expose both Waller and Task Force X in order to take them both down.
What the fuck?
she's already disqualified herself from being a magical Negro in this regard, because unlike them, she has a development arc of her own and is allowed to progress and learn from it. And, in a way, it's one that's a more healthy version of what Chris is going through. Not only does it show that said complexities are universal and reflect multiple problems of societal norms surrounding the likes of classism and race, but it also shows the difference in how individuals that are aware of their circumstances and are mature enough to acknowledge the problems via reflection and realization process their trauma in order to step in the right direction, differ from others who don't have the mental or emotional maturity and strength to completely work on or come to terms with themselves and the things they dealt with in a way that doesn't allow them to fully move on. Adebayo realized that just like humanity has to be the ones to make the decisions to do the right thing themselves, she also has to make a similar choice. And the season ends with her on the course to do so. Chris, however, thanks to how he chose to only focus on the outside orchestrator of his trauma for temporary relief and less on coming to terms with working on forgiving himself before doing so, is going to remain haunted by said orchestrator until he's able to. And as a result, his constant need to relieve himself of said haunting until he's successful in doing so will cause him, to paraphrase a lyric from the band Motley Crue, to run away high so that he won't come home low. And unlike other characters that end up fitting the mold of the traditional magical Negro trope, because that battle is internal, the most Adebayo can do to help Chris find that reflection, acceptance, and self-forgiveness is to wish him the best and be an example to him by bettering herself for herself first and foremost.
Where are you going?
To do the right thing.
Readers, to say that I was surprised at how much I found myself enjoying Peacemaker is an understatement. But if you couldn't tell by how much I gushed about it in this video, the fact that James Gunn found a way to make a character like Peacemaker after doing what he did with him in the Suicide Squad such an interesting dissection in this series is something that I'm impressed with to this day. Not only did he prove that Christopher Smith was the perfect surviving member of the Suicide Squad to give a series to, especially for the second-handed sake of using his helmet as a proper mirror to hold up to the people who needed to receive a very much needed reality check for the hope of starting a movement of self-examination in a lot of individuals in this country. But he did this all while introducing a queer black character into the DC mythos that, while was capable of helping Christopher find some development in how he handles his problems, is not the main function of her character and is allowed to go on her own journey of reflection and betterment in ways that does not abandon neither her blackness or her queerness for the sake of unintentional tokenism. Peacemaker is a good time from start to finish, especially for someone like me who can't help but to look for deeper meaning in the content that I choose to digest. Then again, if you saw the dance number in the opening credits, chances are you already knew that. But I digress, readers. Your homework assignment for the day. Write in the comment section below what you thought of Peacemaker Season 1 if you've seen it. Or if you feel like sharing with the rest of the class a TV show or movie that you've watched that absolutely surprised you with how well conceived the choices for a lot of its storytelling decisions were handled. Bonus points if it used said choices to blatantly tell certain porcelain people that they need to reevaluate things. Like a lot of things. Damn near all the things. You get it. A huge shout out to my patrons, both big and small, for helping make this channel possible. Make sure you check out the card at the end of the video to see if you want to join, or click the link to it or any of my affiliates in the description box below. But until the next time, this is Readus 101. Class dismissed.